Everybody. I just want to welcome you tonight as we're going to get started here in just a second. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Joel Bunch. Just want to welcome you to the Fayetteville Public Library. I'm a librarian in our Adult Services Department, and I just want to tell you a little bit about tonight's event. This is actually our 18th annual gathering of the groups, and tonight's event is a partnership with the Northwest Arkansas Community College. It's a part of their Spring Arts and Culture Festival. And I want to thank Megan Looney Hollingsworth for all of her hard work in facilitating this collaboration. And we're going to spotlight the book, Race Against Time, A Reporter Reopens the Unsolved Murder Cases of the Civil Rights Era by Jerry Mitchell. And I want to thank Kyle Kellums, KUAF News Director, who will be leading tonight's conversation. Also want to thank Pearls Books. They're right outside the door. They'll be selling copies of the books tonight. And then I want to thank the library's deli, which is the 641 Deli. They provided the food. And then want to thank you all again for coming. Your support means a lot. Why we do these things, how we keep them going. And now I want to turn things over to my colleague, Kelly Haley, who's going to tell you a little bit more about tonight's featured guest, Jerry Mitchell.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Kelly Haley. I'm also a librarian in the Adult Services Department. And before you leave tonight, please take a minute to fill out the evaluation forms that we've left on your tables. Let us know what you thought about tonight's program and what your ideas are for other programs. It's your input that helps us determine future events for the library. Jerry Mitchell's investigative reporting brought justice because he never stopped pursuing it, even in the face of angry letters and dozens of death threats. His work has helped put 4 Klansmen behind bars, including the assassin of NAACP leader Medgar Evers, and the man who organized the 1964 killings of civil rights workers James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner, a crime popularized by the movie Mississippi Burning. His work also led to the trial and conviction of serial killer Felix Vale, the oldest conviction in a serial killer case, and perhaps the oldest solved cold case in U.S. history. His stories have also exposed corruption, prompting investigations, state reforms, and the firings of boards and officials. He is a Pulitzer Prize finalist and a winner of more than 30 other national awards, including a MacArthur Genius Grant. After working 30 years for the Mississippi Clarion Ledger, Mitchell left in 2019 and founded the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting. This is a nonprofit that exposes injustices, investigates cold cases, gives voices to the voiceless, and raises up the next generation of investigative reporters. I want to thank Kyle Kellums once again, and please help us welcome Jerry Mitchell.
Thank you all for being here. Jerry, thanks for
thank you for having me.
Heading east.
Good to be here.
The book, Race Against Time, centers on Mississippi, and we'll get to that in a minute, but I know you did not grow up in Mississippi.
No, I didn't. I'm an outsider. Outside agitator. So, yeah.
Grew up in Texarkana?
I did. Schizophrenic town of Texarkana, so yeah, that's where I'm from.
Went to school in Harding and Searcy.
I did.
And I'm just curious, through growing up, through college, how much did you know about this,
right,
civil rights and the Klan?
I mean, almost zero. I always like it. I've compared to this, and my family's gotten on to me, but it's true. It's almost like the civil rights movement, all that took place in some kind of alternate universe. I mean, I remember, for example, when Dr. King was assassinated and things like that, but in terms of affecting my little white bread Southern world, it just didn't affect it. I mean, I hate to say that, but I think that's being honest.
You opened the book, you're covering a screening of the premiere of Mississippi Burning. You're going there to cover
Yeah, just write a story. That's all I went there to do, is write a story, yeah.
But while watching the film, there's an unexpected conversation that serves as the catalyst?
It does. I always say it's the beginning of my education about these kinds of things. There were actually 2 FBI agents who investigated the case who were there at the screening, the press screening. This is a press screening, not a public screening. And then a journalist who covered all this and wrote about it, at the time. And so in my mind, of course, at the time, they were three old men. And of course, now I'm the old one. So, yeah, so everybody else left. And I just, for about 45 minutes, I just kept quizzing. Well, did this really happen? You know, I went through like the whole movie and said, did this happen? Did this not happen? And began to learn about some of the things that happened in the civil rights movement, some of the violence that took place, which I knew, you know, really nothing about.
So as we read in Race Against Time, you eventually work on, I guess we'd call them cold cases, even though the suspects were out in the open.
I always say the thing that made these cases so bad is not just the fact that these guys got away with murder, but the fact that everybody knew they got away with murder. It was absolutely no secret who committed these crimes.
So when you go to an editor or a superior at the newspaper and say, I think I might want to look at this, or... Yeah. I mean... You
can imagine the reaction.
Like it's impossible, or?
Well, I just, it was a piece at a time. I wrote a story about the movie, and I think the thing that shocked me the most about that film was the fact that you had more than 20 Klansmen involved in killing these three young men, and nobody ever been prosecuted for murder. And I covered courts, so I was like, I couldn't wrap my head around that. And then the other things began to kind of happen one at a time that were certainly worth writing about, I guess you'd say. And there wasn't really, at that moment in time, an editor that was going to say, oh, yeah, I can't write that yet. But that did come, yeah.
The book is divided into chapters.
Yep.
But I get the feeling your work on these stories was not segmented. You might be working on the Medgar Evers case.
That's correct.
Yeah.
Well, the way, as you mentioned, the book's divided, it's divided into sections, but those overlapped a lot of times. But I just felt it made it easier for the reader to track one case instead of for me to keep switching back between cases. Yeah.
Well, I've got to ask about your relationship dealing with Byron D. LeBeckwith.
Oh yeah, that was an interesting conversation.
So setting the stage,
sure.
You mentioned it was, widely known that Byron D. LeBeckwith was the murderer?
His murder weapon was found at the dang scene, like just 100 yards from the scene, or less than that actually, and had his fingerprint on it, his weapon and his fingerprint on the weapon. And so it wasn't like it was a secret, and he went around for years bragging about it. So it wasn't like a big secret that he had done this.
He was tried.
He was tried twice in 1964 for murdering Medgar Evers, but they were all white, all male juries. And then you had these two police officers who got him and say, oh yes, we saw Beckwith in Greenwood at the time. He lived in Greenwood, Mississippi, which is in the Delta there.
So in the course of this, you decide you need to
talk to
him. Tell me about how that came about and what that was like.
Yeah, well, actually, I guess part of what I don't mention in the book, which is, I guess, an interesting side note, I just felt it was distracting detail. But actually what happened was a friend, my best friend from college and I were going to go to a Paul McCartney concert. I didn't tell him that. And, but I was going to be in Tennessee, is what I'm trying to say. And so he lived in Signal Mountain, Tennessee, which is just outside of Chattanooga. And so I called him. I had his phone number. I talked to him by phone several times by this point. And I said, hey, I'm going to be in Tennessee. I was wondering if I could come by and talk to you. So in order to talk to him, I kind of had to pass the quiz, which is like, you know, what are your mom and dad's names? Where'd you grow up? Where'd you go to college? You know, this whole, where do you go to church? Where do you live? And, you know, I could have refused to answer, but I knew he'd love my answers, you know. And so I just answered honestly, and he said, come on. And so I went up to see him, spent about 6 hours talking to this guy. Absolutely the most racist person I ever spent serious time with. It was N-word this, N-word that. Then he started on all the other non-white races, also very anti-Semitic. And you know how some people, when you talk to them, you feel like maybe after you need a bath or something, you know? And that's kind of what it felt like, yeah.
Do you think he thought he could talk like this during the 6-hour visit because you were a white guy from the South?
Oh, yeah. He thought I was one of them.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, because here's the other thing I didn't really realize at the time, but I found out later. And you can't tell by my looks right now, but back then I used to look like Opie, like the really, really red hair. And what I didn't know at the time, now he was a member of what's called Christian Identity. Now he did tell me, we talked all about that when we were talking, but I knew nothing about it going in. It's basically a white supremacist religion. It has nothing to do with mainstream Christianity. And so he was a part of that. And so they believe that people like me who are like, albino skinned, that we're like the purest of, like redheads are the purest of the white race.
Oh my.
And I didn't know that. And so he kind of welcomed me like a long lost cousin and said, come on in.
How old were you at the time?
30 by that point, yeah.
Do you think he also spoke freely? I mean, he didn't so much as confess to you, but
No,
but he thought he was untouchable.
exactly. He was arrogant about it. Yeah,
He had been tried twice,
yeah. He'd gotten away with it all those years.
and that also leaned on what was systemic racism in Mississippi at the time, right?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
All white juries.
All white, all male juries. You had assistants, and that's how I first wrote about that story. Was something called the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission. I don't know if you want to talk about that.
I do.
So the Sovereignty Commission, by the way, Arkansas had one of these too. And if anyone's interested in researching it, you should. I don't know if anyone's written anything about the Arkansas one, but I can tell you this about the Arkansas one. They apparently liked what they saw in Mississippi and came over and visited and saw how Mississippi was doing it and said, we got to go back and have our own. And so it was essentially two arms. It was kind of a propaganda arm. It was headed by the governor, by the way, and all the top state leaders. So you had a propaganda arm where they would send speakers up north, white and black, and say how wonderful segregation was. And then they had a spy arm where they would infiltrate civil rights groups and all that kind of stuff. And I don't know if you're like me, but if someone tells me I can't have something, I want it like a million times worse. And so all those records of the Sovereignty Commission were sealed. The Mississippi legislature had voted in 1977 to seal all those records for 50 years. So I basically was like, well, there's something in there, or they wouldn't be sealing for 50 years. So that I began to develop sources, and then those files, I was able to get access to them. What they showed at the same time the state of Mississippi was prosecuting Byron D. LeBeck was for murdering Medgar Evers. This other arm of the state was secretly assisting the defense, trying to get back with acquitted. So that was kind of what led me into that. Yeah.
So this commission, I mean, run by the governor,
Absolutely.
with the specific purpose to maintain segregation.
Yep.
By whatever means possible?
By all means possible. They had police powers. They had, judicial powers. They had, ability to subpoena things and everything else. It's amazing all the powers they had. It probably was unconstitutional, but it never got challenged.
So you're dealing with this systemic racism that was there in Mississippi for a long time. Then you're also dealing with, I guess, this idea that there's potential embarrassment.
Oh, yeah.
If this is released.
Oh, yeah.
So you're dealing with the present and the past. How do you chip away to get this?
Well, I think that's what you do. You chip away a piece at a time. I don't think you have to, it's the old story about how do you eat an elephant, one piece at a time, So I think that's how you start. You just do it gradually. It was more of gradual reporting as opposed to just some huge expose.
When Byron D. LeBeckwith finally goes on trial again, and there's no certainty along the way that this is going to happen.
No,
You've got to have some dogged prosecution. You've got to have a belief that it's not double jeopardy and all of this. When he finally goes on trial, is his arrogance still there?
Yeah, he was pretty arrogant. I mean, he wanted to testify. And of course, the defense lawyers basically kind of sat on him and it wouldn't let him testify. But he really, really wanted to testify. He testified in the previous two trials, you see, and basically, I had some of the original jurors, I interviewed some of them, and they were telling me they were all ready to acquit Beckwith, and then he got on the witness stand. Mm. So that lets you know about, even back then, his arrogance showed. I know one of the prosecutors from back then told me that he took the rifle, of course this is the same rifle that killed Medgar Evers. He took the rifle and did like that, and the jurors were like all ducking.
Well, and this rifle also has an interesting story.
It's a whole another story, yeah.
It was treated as this sort of, I don't know, artifact or totem that got passed around?
Yeah, so here's the wild thing, the way I always talk about this case, is when I first wrote about this case, the odds were literally more than 1,000,000 to 1 against this case ever being reopened and re-prosecuted. I mean, there's no murder weapon, no transcript, no trial transcript, nothing in the court files of any kind of value, any other kind of evidence. But Myrlie Evers, the widow of Medgar Evers, prayed and some amazing things happened. A couple of months later, Jackson police were cleaning out a closet and found a box that contained the crime scene photographs of the killing of Medgar Evers, including a fingerprint of Byron Diedelbeck with lifter for the murder weapon. And a few months after that, she shared with me her copy of the trial transcript. And a few months after that, the prosecutor in the case found the murder weapon in his father-in-law's closet, which sounds like I'm making it up. This is why I like nonfiction, yeah.
Well, and again, I think it comes back to the idea that you could get away with murder.
Oh, yeah.
Because you'd think the gun would get destroyed or something, but
I know, but it got saved as a souvenir, obviously.
Yeah.
And to tell a little bit more about who the prosecutor's father-in-law was, he was a judge. And in fact, he was one of the judges who locked up the Freedom Riders back in the 1961. So, yeah.
And through this process, you're also talking to Ms. Evers.
I am.
Your widow.
Yep.
And what was that relationship like?
Well, it grew over time. And, you know, I had already interviewed her for a previous story. And so we had somewhat of a relationship already. And then I sent her my first story, you know, that had to do with this. And she came back and said, because I asked her as my question, do you think the case needs to be reopened? And she came back and said, yes, it does. So that was kind of what began, you know, the ball rolling on talk of possibly reopening the case and what would it mean and what was available and that kind of thing. But she and I got very, very close. We're, to this day, you know, very close. In fact, I'll see, Lord willing, I'll see her next week. She's got her 90th.
Wow.
Myrlie Evers is celebrating her 90th birthday next week, so it's pretty exciting, yeah.
Another one of the murders that's covered in Race Against Time is that of Vernon Dahmer Sr.
Yeah.
Who was trying to register people to vote, trying to make sure American citizens could vote, and that was too much.
Too much for the Klan, and others as well. Obviously, they were trying to do everything to thwart black voting, and so the Klan attacked him and his family in the middle of the night, January 10th, 1966, set the house on fire. Began firing their guns into the house, and Vernon Dahmer woke up, grabbed a shotgun, ran to the front of the house, began firing back at the Klansmen so his family could escape safely out a back window. And unfortunately, flames of the fire seared his lungs, and he died, you know, the next day.
What was pivotal about getting the people responsible for that case back in the courtroom?
Well, lots of things. Sam Bowers was the head of the Klan. He was the one that the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, which was the most violent Klan organization, responsible for at least 10 killings we know of in Mississippi. So Bowers had been tried and never been convicted in that case. So at first, the district attorney acted like he was going to do something about the case, and he went out of office. Another guy came in, and it seemed even less likely that it would happen. And then I got this phone call out of the blue. I was literally in Ohio working on my master's at Ohio State when I get this phone call from this guy. Wouldn't identify himself, but wanted to meet with me. And so I flew back to Mississippi and met with him. And it turned out he was a recovering gambling addict. And one of the 12 steps is to make amends for the bad stuff you've done in the past. He was a kid, he worked for Sam Bowers, and overheard Bowers give the orders to kill Vernon Dahmer. So that was kind of the first break, I guess you could say, in the case.
In each of these cases, there are people that can place the murderer or murderers at the place,
Yeah.
heard the confession,
Yep.
and over decades, for whatever reason, they decide to
Yep.
help.
Exactly. I think, you know, they feel safer. I mean, obviously at this moment in time, if you would come forward, you know, and he was a kid at the time, so you wouldn't necessarily expect a kid to come forward. But yeah, people, there's a little more, feel a little more safe than maybe they felt back in the 60s for sure.
But prosecutors have a challenge because often you're dealing with memories that are decades old.
Yep.
And defense attorneys would love to pick
Yeah,
those
they try
apart.
their best to attack that. So yeah, it's a real challenge, and that's what I always say about these cases. I think sometimes people think it's easy to get these cases together, but it's actually, these cases are far, far harder than your average murder case because of how much time you have to spend on them.
And time is of the essence.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I came up with the title.
Yeah.
You know, it was
I mean,
a race against time. Yeah.
You've got witnesses and murderers that aren't going to be on the planet forever.
Yeah, exactly. So you have witnesses that are dying, suspects that are dying. These cases are not getting better with age. So that's one of the reasons.
As these cases are going to court, getting closer to court, what's the reaction of the present-day Mississippians?
Well, that kind of changed over time. I would say initially, I mean, I got a lot of hate mail and calls and people saying, what are you writing about this dead N-word and stuff like that, and people were not happy. But over time, there was a little bit of a change, I think. I know by the time they had the Mississippi burning trial, which was the last of those trials, that they did a poll and actually more people, Neshoba County was where this happened, and it was the last place I figured they'd be able to get a trial. You just didn't expect a trial to be held, and an indictment did happen. And so they did eventually. Basically, the polls showed that more people favored prosecution than not, which kind of surprised me. So it let me know there was a bit of a change. From the polling, limited polling there was over time, it appeared that the attitudes of people began to change about it. Like they weren't, initially they totally opposed it, or at least in the white community, and then white Mississippians did, and that began to change.
Was there a change among your colleagues or your editors?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm certain once a first case has been successfully prosecuted.
Yeah, and there was one editor, and he's in the book, but there was one editor who wasn't really thrilled about this and really didn't want me doing the story and writing about all this. He didn't think it was that important. And he got lots of hate mail and calls. I know he did, and I'm not trying to beat up on him, but I think after it finally, had a verdict in that case and it finally happened, that he realized, hey, yeah, this is, something needs to happen.
The murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner happen. There are nearly 24 Klansmen complicit, including law enforcement officers.
Yes.
It's horrific.
It is. It's a lynching, carried out by law enforcement, essentially.
Premeditated. I mean, they had the plan. Arrest these guys, keep them long enough, then trail them.
Release them in the hands of waiting Klansmen. And they had done that 3 weeks earlier with another guy, and that was the reason why the FBI later on figured out how they did it. That was essentially what they did. You lock them up, you release them at night into the hands of these waiting Klansmen. Yeah.
It's just unfathomable.
It is.
I mean, it isn't because it happened, but.
Well, there was a whole series, there was a whole series of harassment and violence against black men that happened in Neshoba County during this period of time leading up to these killings. So yeah, it was just horrific. And the fact that, it was 44 days in between when they killed these guys, these young men, and before their bodies were even found, yeah.
What's the work and patience required to do this kind of journalism? Because you're not, turning a story every day.
No.
You're waiting for history to sort of.
Well, I think it's persistence. I mean, I think if someone asked me what's the most important characteristic in being, toward being an investigative reporter, it would be persistence. I mean, you have to kind of be like a dog with a bone, you have to just not let go of it because there's so many opportunities to do that. I know with the Mississippi burning case at one point, because I was getting discouraged and it had been a period of time and it looked like it just wasn't going to happen. And I remember so distinctly, I put on my screensaver on my computer the reward poster for the 3 civil rights workers that has their photos on it. And I just did that as a reminder to myself, hey, don't forget about this because I had daily reporting I had to do as well during that period of time.
What was the relationship you had with prosecutors who were thinking about reopening these cases?
Well, it was real mixed. I mean, some I had great relationships with. Doug Jones, who later became senator in Alabama, who was U.S. attorney in Alabama when this case got reopened. Yeah, I had a great relationship with him, with Doug, for example. But then I had kind of, I'd say, a mixed relationship with, say, the prosecutor in the Medgar Evers case, because at times he would love me and other times he'd hate my guts. So it kind of went back and forth depending on the story I wrote. But my dedication was to the story, not to the prosecutor.
Sure.
And so that's the way I felt about it. Yeah.
Did you get the feeling that the prosecutors were interested in justice?
I think so, in general.
Yeah.
And that they wanted to see justice done for the most part. But there certainly were people, and there were a lot of cases that didn't get prosecuted. So there certainly were cases where prosecutors, if you went to them and talked to them about, they were like, oh, that's 30 years ago. I don't want to have anything to do with that. What evidence is there? But whereas there were people like Bobby DeLauder, who did step up when, you know, this first arose and got involved with it. He didn't have to get involved with it, and then others that followed him. Yeah.
You mentioned Doug Jones, and you had this great conversation that you had with him on the phone.
Yeah.
It's the 16th Street church bombing, and it's this sort of this dance. He says, Jerry, there's something you and the defense have both missed, but I can't tell you.
Yeah, exactly.
You say, I won't print it. And he says, I can't tell you.
Yeah, I know. I'm trying to convince him. It was a really critical piece of evidence in the Bobby Cherry case. What it was really clever. In fact, I was just talking to the prosecutor who found that, whose name is Don Cochran. He used to be U.S. attorney in Nashville. But Don figured it out. And what it is Bobby Cherry had given a statement saying he was in the sign shop on this night, which was the same night that the Klan made the bomb. There was it gets way down in the weeds, but there was this thing they commonly called the kitchen tape, which was this Tommy Blanton talk about the Klan making the bomb, and Blanton was part of that conspiracy to make that bomb. And so they knew it was made in the sign shop, and Bobby Cherry put himself there at the sign shop in his own statement. So they were able to use that statement plus that tape. But what they did during trial, which is pretty unusual, most of the time when prosecutors get up in opening arguments, they're going to tell their whole case. Like, here's what we're going to lay out for you, and here's what we're going to do. They never connected those two pieces of evidence. So what they did is they left it till closing arguments to connect the two pieces of evidence. And that's what Doug was talking about. Yeah.
When you're working on these cases, it seems like you have to pay so much attention to what people say. And there's this one case where innocence is proclaimed because, and I can't remember who it was now.
Bobby Cherry with the wrestling?
Yes, Bobby Cherry with the wrestling. It couldn't have been me because I went home every Saturday night and I watched pro wrestling, which of course, if you grew up in the South,
yeah, that's what you did.
you understood that.
I'll tell you about that.
Yes.
So I went to go interview Bobby Cherry. His wife had actually reached out to me, and I'd talked to him by phone before. And so I went over there to interview him. He lived near Tyler, Texas, which is not far from where I grew up. So I knew where he lived, and took him and his wife out for barbecue because I guess that's what you take Klansmen out for. I'm not really sure, but anyway. But we ate barbecue, we talked. He's like, I didn't have anything to do with that church bombing. I left that sign shop at 9:45. And the sign shop, by the way, I did mention earlier, it's only like 2 blocks from the church. I left that sign shop at 9:45 because I had to get home and watch wrestling. And he pulled out this sworn statement from this woman. Yes, I remember that night. Well, we're all sitting around watching wrestling. Well, the basic rule in journalism is this, and this is the way we say it in the South. Even if your mama tells you she loves you, check it out. And so I did. And so I went to our librarian, Susan Garcia, the next morning. I said, Susan, just check with the Birmingham News, see what was on TV that night. And of course, I remember from when I was a kid, I used to put the entire TV schedule.
These columns, yeah.
Yeah, it wasn't even that big of a box when I was a little kid. And she came back to me the next day and said there was no wrestling. So he got arrested.
Because you're dealing with lies and memories in all of these. And
Yeah. It was an alibi he made up later.
yeah. I think it's so important that we hear these stories and how powerful the Klan was and how they,
absolutely.
and they weren't that as secret as I think we tend to think, that people knew somebody was in the Klan, that
Oh, yeah.
your mechanic or your barber.
Or you certainly suspect it, I'll put it that way. You know.
And I think for people younger than you, younger than me, it's important to realize just how prevalent and how systemic this was.
And you have to realize, too, that the Klan, one of the main places that they recruited, you see this with the Edgar Ray killings, he recruited a lot of Klansmen, was law enforcement. So maybe they would go get people who were actually on the force or people that served as auxiliary deputies or whatever, or auxiliary police. So there were a ton of people that were law enforcement who were in the Klan in those days. In fact, some of them actually testified in the Mississippi burning trial. It's 67, I'm talking about the federal trial, yeah.
Of course, for every case that did get reopened and a murderer successfully sent to prison, there are others that...
Oh, yeah, far more that yeah, as I say in the afterward, I've been unsuccessful far more than I've been successful. So it's just because these cases are very tough. They're not easy. And to be honest, I kind of, in terms of the cases, I mean, I make clear how they came across my vision or whatever, but obviously there are cases that had almost no evidence or, it just is a lot more difficult. If you have a transcript, for example, that's a lot easier case to do than if you don't have a transcript. And so those kind of things play into how far you can go with it. Yeah.
Medgar Evers, the bombing murders of Addie Mae Collins, Denise McNair, Carol Robertson, Cynthia Wesley. These were high profile. Does that help them get reopened?
I think so, to some extent. You know, that helped, at least from a standpoint of attention. It got more attention. And in fact, that's kind of how the bombing itself case got reopened initially, was the guy that was U.S. attorney was trying to improve relations with the black community and met with him. And basically some of the black leaders said to him, well, you've never done anything but the church bombing. And so they started looking at it again.
And we're going to have a chance for people,
Audience.
y'all, to ask questions. I've got a few more. Did you ever feel unsafe? I mean, if you were getting calls, you say that so nonchalant.
Yeah. Well, I've had dozens of death threats. I mean, it sounds crazy to say it that way, I guess, but yeah, it just kind of comes with the territory. You know, a Klansman say he was going to slit my throat. Another Klansman who said he had pictures of me and knew where I lived, and yeah, that's disconcerting, but it led to kind of an unexpected gift, and that's kind of why it was called the gift of living fearlessly, because living fearlessly is not about living without fear. It's about living beyond fear. And I think that's what I see in these cases. You know, you want to, whether we're talking about these kind of cases or we're talking about anyone in whatever walk of life you're in, you want to live for something greater than ourselves. That's what it's about.
If you're in the courtroom and a conviction comes in, decades late, but still a conviction, I imagine there are mixed feelings. I mean,
Oh, sure.
you're pleased that a murderer is going to prison, but that's not bringing back Vernon Dahmer Jr. or any...
Yeah. Well, it was real interesting because the way the families felt about it, sometimes people said, well, what does it matter? He's been free all this time. What does it matter? And yes, it's imperfect justice by any stretch that these guys walked around all those days. But when you talk to the families, they felt it was incredibly important because it wasn't just locking this guy up. It was society saying, this is wrong. We were wrong for not doing it before, and taking a stand against this kind of hate that unfortunately we've still got around.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the Mississippi Center for Investigative Report.
Sure.
How did that come about, and what's...
Well, it was about the Clarion Ledger, which is a statewide paper in Mississippi, and owned by Gannett. It was about the third go-round for buyouts. So I thought, I better take this one. And so I took it, and I thought, well, what am I going to do? And I'm like, I think I'll start a nonprofit, because Mississippi needs more investigative reporting, not less. And I'm sure the same is true of Arkansas, that you need more investigative reporting and not less. So I don't know if Arkansas has one, but if not, they need one.
It's hard work.
It is. And that's why I think it helps, because you've got the funding to be able to spend the time that's so necessary. I know we're working on a project right now. I've got another investigative reporter working with me. And we started work on this project last summer. And it's with the New York Times, and it's going to be, I think our first story will be out later this month, hopefully. But it takes time. It takes time.
And so a center like this, you can have time. I know that if you're a newspaper and you've got column inches that have to be filled every day.
You have to feed the beast, so to speak, as they say. Yeah, absolutely.
Rewarding work?
Oh, I'm having a blast. I love it. This sounds weird, but if the bad guys aren't insulting me, I feel like I haven't been doing my dang job.
A character that appears in this book,
Sure.
Race Against Time, that I was previously unfamiliar with, but have since reading this book read into, Richard Barrett.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring Richard Barrett up. He's a fascinating character. I actually was going to write more about Richard, but we kind of pared it back a little bit. He was a white supremacist who became a very valuable source for me.
Yeah.
It's very, it seems to go against, he would do things that would seem against his own cause. But he loved talking, he loved me for whatever reason. The other part of what I can tell you about Richard, which I just didn't get into in the book, is Richard was secretly gay. So he was a white supremacist who would publish in his own publication bashing gays, and he was secretly gay. In fact, he died tragically, and that's a whole nother story about Richard. But yeah, for whatever reason, he would call, he let me know about the flyers that Beckwith was putting out, basically trying to influence the jury to acquit him in that trial, the new trial. And he told me about that, and I came over to his law office, and he gave me copies of it. He just asked me to not identify him directly. I'm like, okay. Did not identify him as the source of it, and I didn't. So
He was Christian identity, white nationalist?
he was more what I would call, he wasn't.
Okay.
Some of these, Beckwith was, Bowers was Christian identity. A lot of these guys were in the 60s. And we could talk about Christian identity more, but he was actually what I would call more like neo-Nazi, you know what I mean? That kind of thing, yeah.
So yeah, let's talk just a little bit before we get to audience questions about Christian identity and the role it played in the Klan and spreading hate.
It's this white supremacist religion, and so it kind of cuts across lines in terms of groups. So maybe the Klan, the Klan here, if you've ever heard of Aryan Nations, they were Christian identity. And Aryan Nations was connected with a ton of violence. There was a Brinks truck that got, a bank truck that got robbed for, $4 million, and a DJ in Denver who was killed. And there were all this terrible violence that Aryan Nations was connected to. And Richard Butler was the head of that. And Beckwith knew him. I didn't know any of this. All of a sudden, Beckwith's telling me about being friends with Richard Butler, and I didn't know who Richard Butler was. But I went to the library and I started reading up I was like, oh my goodness, But here's what Christian identity believes, and I'm going to tell it bluntly and therefore kind of offensively. So I don't mean this to be offensive, but telling it bluntly makes it offensive. Christian identity believes that Adam and Eve were white people. They believe that all the non-white races were created on the sixth day and call them mud people and don't have souls. They're like animals that don't have souls. And then they believe that Jews are the literal offspring of Satan. This is all horribly offensive, but this is what they believe. Yeah.
And this formed their move to violence and...
Yeah, and there was a big Christian identity preacher in Harrison. I'm trying to think, I'll think of his name, Tom Robb. Is he still around? I don't know.
Still is.
He's still around. I've interviewed him before. I didn't know if he's still alive or not, but yeah.
Yeah. Still buys some billboards in Harrison from time to time.
Oh, really? Wow.
Yeah. It's an amazing book, and I want to talk just briefly about how it's written. You can
thank
tell
you.
you're a journalist.
Oh, well, thank
Because
you.
it's heavy subject, it can be complicated, but boy, you just clip along.
Thank you.
And
I love those kind of books. I think at least a couple of books probably influenced it. One was All the President's Men. So I kind of wanted to write it as a detective story on the kind of the most basic level. And then the other book I remember reading when I was in grad school at Ohio State, and this is when I started reading this nonfiction. I was like, I didn't know you could write nonfiction like that. You know what I mean? So that was really eye-opening to me. And it was Hot Zone by Preston. And it just clips like this. And it's just a riveting tale. And it reads like fiction. And I was like, oh, that's the book I want to write. I want to write it so it reads like fiction and people can't put it down. So that was my goal.
so finally, how do you decide what isn't included? Because I'm sure this
Oh, my
book could have
goodness.
been four times the size.
Well, it was, when I did my first draft, I was working with my editor, and he was telling me, I've forgotten, at some point, I basically the first year I was just writing this draft, you know, and I've forgotten, I think I told him how many words I was at. He said, oh, that's too many. I said, okay, just let me get on paper. And so the first draft was almost twice as long as the book is right now. So it was, between the editor and I, we just kind of worked on it over the next, I guess, 3 years, just trying to cull it down here and there. And it took longer to cut it than it did to write the first draft.
I'm sure, yeah.
Yeah.
All right, we have a microphone right up here. Joel, you gonna
There you go.
get that? So I'd love to hear some questions. I haven't asked everything, I know.
If you'd like to ask a question, if you'll use this one or the one over there, and just queue up if there's more than one.
Why don't you go around? Yeah.
So does anyone have a question? I've asked them all? Come on. I've never been at a gathering of the groups where this was the case.
You should take the microphone around. I think that'll be easier than, yeah, there you go.
I'll do one.
Ah, thank you.
There you go.
In reading the book, you talked about when witnesses are dead, but previous testimony could still be used.
Correct.
Is that something that is possible in all 50 states? Is this?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know about every state, but I think it's most states. What it is, here's the question. Were they cross-examined? Were they cross-examined, you know, or it couldn't just be like an affidavit or something like that, where people just give a sworn statement. It would have to be subjected, the witness would have had to have been subjected to both direct and cross-examination. And then it can be used. I think most states have that rule, that you can use it in that situation. Good question.
Got a question?
Thank you so much for your time tonight. As you start to see some of the civil rights almost be rewound lately, are you starting to feel history repeating itself again? Are you seeing concerns? And how do we sort of call attention to that better?
Well, the way I kind of think of history is history runs in concentric circles, if that makes any sense. Like, it doesn't exactly repeat, but it runs in concentric circles. And I think that we are repeating our history to an extent. And the reason I think to some extent we're doing it is because we don't know our history. I certainly didn't know our history going into this. And I can tell you people who've read this book, who've written me or emailed me or whatever and said, I had no idea all these things happened. And I think that's valuable. I think we need that history. And I guess we're pretty much in the Bible Belt. I can get away with saying this. You know, sometimes people today don't want certain subjects talked about. They say it might make people uncomfortable, and or it's too tragic or too sad or something like that. And so, well, it's never stopped us from reading the Bible, has it? You know, you know. And there are a lot of tragic stories in it, but we keep reading it. Why do we keep reading it? Well, because we can learn from it. And the same thing is true of history. Why do we read history? Well, we can learn from it. So I think I would love to see people know better about history. I know I wasn't taught this history at all, so.
And that knowledge of history informs what we know about the present.
Exactly, because you realize something that's happening is an echo, if that makes any sense. I'll give a simple example. When a young man walked into the church in Charleston in 2015 and killed those 9 beautiful people in that church, what you may or may not realize is what website he was looking at before he walked into that church. It was a website for the descendant of the White Citizens Council, which of course started in Mississippi. There was chapters here in Arkansas and elsewhere, all across the country, by the way. So that's, if you don't know that history, you follow what I'm saying, you're not aware of that echo. It just seems like, oh, well, he's just a crazy guy, and you know. But no, I mean, these things have effects. You can't propagate hate and not expect results. I mean, politicians can't come out and denounce an entire race of people and denigrate them and not have any effect. Another example, El Paso in 2019, the guy drove from the Dallas area all the way to El Paso and killed 24 Hispanic Americans. And the thing he said the reason he did it was to halt the invasion, which is the exact same language that Sam Bowers used in the summer of 1964. He said, we're going to halt this invasion by these civil rights workers. And so these things, there's a great book on this by Sam Keen, K-E-E-N. It's called Faces of the Enemy. And the idea behind it is before people kill with their weapons, they kill with their minds. And see, before people hate, they fear. And when they fear, they give themselves permission to, they dehumanize people, basically. And once you dehumanize somebody, then you have permission to destroy them, really, whether that's figuratively or politically or literally.
I have a question over there.
What was the relationship between Medgar Evers and Martin Luther King?
They were really good friends. In fact, if you want to go online and read it, you can read Dr. King's speech in Detroit after Medgar was assassinated. Medgar was actually going to be, I believe, the vice president of SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But the NAACP said, no, you can't do that. They didn't want to belong to another civil rights organization. And so he had to step down from that. But Dr. King talked about Medgar in that speech in Detroit. And the other thing that's kind of significant about this speech in Detroit, which a lot of people don't even know about, is that's where he delivered the first, I have a dream speech. He actually talked about I have a dream in his Detroit speech. And the story goes that while Dr. King was delivering his March on Washington speech, someone said to him, tell him about the dream. And that's when he broke into this speech he had already done before in Detroit. Yeah.
There's a question here.
You mentioned the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission, and you mentioned the Citizens Council. Were those directly connected, or did they spring up separately?
Well, the White Citizens Council, as it's sometimes called, actually wasn't called white, but that name's kind of been tagged on, everybody knows it that way, was created about the same time Brown versus Board of Education came down in '54. And then it was private organization, obviously, made up by all these, in Mississippi, business professionals and you name it. It was kind of, as what Harding Carter put it, the Uptown Klan, anyway. And, but they existed, and then the Sovereignty Commission came along. And the guy who was involved in the creation, it was the first executive director for the Citizens Council, told me they modeled the Sovereignty Commission after the White Citizens Council. And in fact, the Sovereignty Commission helped fund the White Citizens Council. There was actually taxpayer money that went from the Sovereignty Commission to the pockets of the White Citizens Council. So there was a very direct connection.
I remember once, we are Mississippians.
Where y'all from?
Well, I'm from Winona, he's from Clarksdale.
Oh, very good.
But I remember, I didn't know what they were talking about, but I heard my dad answer my mother, I don't think that's the kind of thing we want to get involved with. And as I learned more about that, I thought, I think that's what they must have been talking about. But anyway,
Yeah.
it's always kind of been in my mind. I do have a question. I don't know, I may be going far afield on this. On Christian identity. From
Right.
what you said, it seems that they discount a lot that was in the Old Testament about creation.
Yeah.
Do they identify with, is there anything in the New Testament they could possibly identify with when you consider the teachings that are there? I can't put my mind together on these.
Well, it's crazy. I mean, I'll be the first thing to say that. But I can explain, I'll explain like one aspect. I'm not going to try and get, well, they believe, let me explain this part. They think, well, I'll tell the Adam and Eve part, then I'll tell the second part. Okay. In Genesis 1, I think it's 23, where it says there was no man to till the soil. The word man is Adam or Adam, right? And that literally means blood in the face. And so what he claims is only the white race can blush. Now, it's ridiculous. All races blush. And, but that's what these races say. And then go forward, they believe, and this kind of relates to something that predated Christian identity. It was called Anglo-Israelism. That kind of sprang up in the late 1800s, early 1900s, not just in America, but in Europe as well. This belief that the European and nations as well as America were the lost tribes of Israel, the 10 lost tribes. You know, the ones that went off into captivity and were basically assimilated according to history, but according to them, they went to Europe, you know, and so, yeah.
Time for a couple more questions.
Hi there. These stories are making me remember some of my family history and all these things. My family remembers my grandfather voting for George Wallace.
Yeah.
And later in life, he went to a church with a black female pastor. So I guess my question to you is, can you remember talking with anybody who had a real change? And
Yeah.
what do you think caused this rethinking, this repentance kind of?
Well, I can tell you a really good story about that. I'll tell one quick reference to one. Thomas Terrence, actually has written a book about this in his own life. He was a bomber for the Klan. And then I don't think he still works for him, but he did up until recently work for the C.S. Lewis Institute. So he was actually involved in a shootout with police, and he was just a horrible guy, and underwent a conversion. And he has a real interesting story if you want to read it. I wrote a piece about him and John Perkins, who's a black preacher from Jackson, who got involved in the civil rights movement. It's called The Preacher and the Klansman. I think that's online somewhere that you can find. But anyway, back to the first example I give is Billy Ray Pitts, who was involved in the killing of Vernon Dahmer, dropped his gun, got caught, pleaded guilty to murder, got a life sentence for that, and pleaded guilty to a federal charge and got 5 years for that. So fast forward, he turned state's evidence against all these Klan guys and ended up testifying against Bowers. That's a long, involved story, but I'm skipping a bunch of stuff, but I'll get to the end. He testified, Bowers was convicted, and there was a hearing a few months later, and Billy Ray Pitts testified in the hearing. When he got done, he walked to the back of the courtroom and he ran into Mrs. Dahmer, the widow of Vernon Dahmer. And he asked Mrs. Dahmer to forgive him for killing her husband. And she forgave him. And she began to cry. He began to cry. And it was just one of the most incredible moments of my life in terms of witnessing just this incredible confession And the fact that she forgave him, and in my own mind, I was thinking, could I forgive someone that killed my dad or my spouse or whatever? You know, that would be a tough thing, wouldn't it? Yeah, that would be very tough. So I've seen it play out, and most Klansmen not repent, but there have been some examples of that.
Is there one more question?
Yes, I do have one question.
Two more questions, okay.
Last August, the grand jury declined to indict Carolyn Bryant Dunham,
Yep.
the woman whose accusations led to the murder of Emmett Till. What is your take on that?
I've written some pieces on that if you want to Google them, rather than me. I don't know that I'll cover every bit of this. So just, Jerry Mitchell, Emmett Till, you'll probably get most of them. But essentially, she lied. Now, what she lied about was when she testified. She originally told the defense lawyers that, Emmett Till had just grabbed her hand and asked for a date. And then, of course, what she testified to was he all but raped her, essentially, sexually assaulted her. And we have the records for that. In terms of her being prosecuted is obviously a legal question in terms of having the witnesses. It's a shame. This case could have been done back in 2007 for sure. And it's a shame that they didn't have access to those documents I just mentioned. And so the jury, one of the grand jurors I talked to back in 2000, who was a grand juror in 2007, said if they'd had that evidence, they would have indicted her. They also had a witness who was among those who was a black man that they had identified initially, or basically pulled over initially to say, ask Carolyn if this was the guy. And she said no, and they tossed him out of the truck and he lost his front teeth. And so there was probably enough evidence to prosecute her now. I don't know if there's enough at this point because of the deaths of almost all the witnesses, which is unfortunate. But reading my pieces on it, I actually got a copy of her memoir, unpublished memoir, as well as interviews she did. I will tell you this, in my opinion, and you can read the FBI report closing the case, and they basically agree with me. In my opinion, the FBI's opinion, she never recanted. It was reported, even in a book, that she recanted, and my opinion is she never recanted because her unpublished memoir and the interview she did make clear that went beyond recanting. She doubled down. She claimed Emmett Till identified himself to the killers. I don't believe that anymore in The Man in the Moon. I mean, there's no way. Scared kid, 14 years old, in the middle of the night. I don't believe any of that. So whether the grand jury did the right thing or not, did she deserve to be punished for that? It seems pretty obvious, given her identification of him, that she played a role in this. But Mose Wright's unfortunately dead. You follow what I'm saying? I'm not discounting she's guilty. The question is, do they have enough evidence to prove it? And unfortunately, I fear they don't at this point. And the unfortunate part too is obviously the grand jury. I don't know how seriously they took it or investigated it because they didn't have access to that. Like the thing I'm talking about, it's not like the grand jury had access to what I had access to. So, and they should have. And I think it appeared to me with that grand jury that was something they rushed to do just to kind of quiet everybody up, which is unfortunate.
One more question.
For defendants who had been acquitted and then retried,
they can't be acquitted and retried.
Well, that was what I was getting. But what about Beckwith? How did they?
Well, he wasn't. Here's the way it works. So if you're tried and there's a mistrial, it's as if the trial never took place. In other words, like a jury has to agree unanimously. So in the Emmett Till case, those guys were acquitted. So they could never be retried for murder. Now, they could have been retried for kidnapping, but they didn't do that because they admitted they kidnapped him. So that would have been a possible retrial on that point, but they couldn't have been retried for murder. But as long as there's a mistrial, you can at least in theory have 100 trials. I mean, not that you'd want to do that, but I'm just saying. The reason is because you're not arriving at a result, whether that's an acquittal or it's a conviction. So it's not a violation of the Sixth Amendment, you know, of double jeopardy in the Constitution, yeah.
All right. Opportunity to sign books. Thank you very much for your great questions, your attention. Thank you to the Fayetteville Public Library and to Pearl's Books. Jerry Mitchell, thank you.
Thank you very much. This is great.
If you know a school library that doesn't have this book, let's put it in there. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.